During the 1920s, America was thriving. National wealth had doubled from the year 1920 to 1929, over 12 million households purchased radios, and electric refrigerators became widely available. The Ford Model T revolutionized travel, places such as motels, grocery stores, and movie theaters were now easily accessible, and large-scale automobile companies created thousands of new jobs. Americans began moving into cities, people didn't have to sew their own clothes, and citizens all across America began buying the same brands of food, listening to the same music, and doing the same dance. This became known as the Roaring Twenties. Disposable incomes rose, families had more money, and everyone, including line workers, janitors, the ultra-rich, and even banks using customers' deposits, started pouring money into the stock market. At a time with no Robinhood or Charles Schwab, investors had to visit brokerages in person to buy stocks. And with no Twitter or iPhones, important news about companies that happened after the morning newspaper would be distributed when a paperboy announced a midday extra. Everyone was buying stock who could, and the speculation in the stock market was reckless. Consumers took out loans from banks to buy stocks. Market caps were driven up far above the actual values of the companies, and in August of 1929, it reached its peak. Wages were lowering, farmers were struggling, production was declining, and household debt was skyrocketing. Finally, by October 24th, a day known as Black Thursday, the stock market shattered. Almost 12.9 million stocks were sold. Some bankers and investors purchased shares thinking they could take advantage of the decline in price. On Friday, it seemed like their efforts were working, with the market making a small rebound. But come Monday, they began to fall again. And on Thursday, a record 16.4 million shares were sold on the New York Stock Exchange. Investors and households lost fortunes, and many who had mortgages had now foreclosed on their homes. The impact on families was devastating. Harvesting crops became too expensive for farmers, breadlines and soup kitchens were becoming overwhelmed, and homelessness was rising. And then in the early 1930s, a drought hit the region of the Great Plains that included southeastern Colorado, southwestern Kansas, the panhandles of Texas, Oklahoma, northeastern New Mexico, killing livestock and crops and forcing thousands of families to leave in search for work. And then the banking panics, as if this couldn't get any worse. Later in 1930, big investors ran to the banks to withdraw deposits because they were concerned about the solvency of their banks. To explain this more, when you deposit money into a bank, the money isn't just stored in vaults. Banks will lend out the money, for example, as mortgages and business loans. If those loans don't get paid back or the bank can't sell the collateral they collect on, then your money is lost. So basically, the investors were worried about losing their money for good. This continued from 1930 to 1932, and by 1933, banks had, in fact, become insolvent. And when regular people have their money in banks and they become insolvent, then there is no way they can get that money back. It was effectively wiped out and gone forever. President Herbert Hoover had a hands-off approach to the Great Depression, believing that natural market forces would fix everything. He did, though, offer government loans to banks, who would then loan the money to businesses, who would then hire people and grow the economy again. Whatever he did was not good enough, and Hoover lost the election in 1932 to Franklin Delano Roosevelt. In office, Roosevelt coordinated a 4-day bank holiday, which allowed for Congress to convene and determine appropriate legislation to reopen banks. Roosevelt's fireside chats also helped to encourage Americans to regain confidence. In addition, he passed legislation that aimed to create jobs and stimulate the economy. Also, remember how banks became insolvent? Well, as a part of the Banking Act of 1933, Roosevelt created the FDIC, or the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, to protect bank depositors and ensure a level of trust in the American banking system. He also passed the Securities and Exchange Act of 1934, which created the Securities Exchange Commission to oversee the stock market and propose enforcing security laws to protect investors. As a remedy to the Great Depression, Roosevelt passed a series of programs known as the New Deal. This included repealing prohibition so that people could buy alcohol again. As you can imagine, alcohol has a lot of consumers and producers involved and is therefore good for the economy. Also, the Tennessee Valley Authority Act was passed, which permitted governments to build dams along the Tennessee River, which gave hydroelectric power to those living near them. There were a variety of other bills passed designed to regulate banks, such as the Glass-Steagall Act, and others designed for collective bargaining and unionization, such as the National Industrial Recovery Act. Yet these efforts were not enough. Unemployment was still high, and farmers in the Dust Bowl still struggled. In spring of 1935, Roosevelt began the Second New Deal, which were more aggressive forms to remedy the Great Depression. This included the Works Progress Administration, which provided paid working opportunities for the unemployed. Finally, the Wagner Act supervised union elections and worked to stop the maltreatment of workers, and the Social Security Act of 1935 guaranteed pensions to the elderly and provided unemployment and disability insurance to those who needed it. With GDP growing at 9% per year from 1933 to 1936, things were starting to look promising. And then in 1937, a recession was caused because the Federal Reserve raised the reserve requirement. This effectively means that banks can't lend out as much as it previously had in deposits, and less lending typically means less growth, hence a recession. Finally, Roosevelt had voiced his support for Britain and France in the Second World War, and American factories began ramping up production, creating jobs and growth. It wasn't until December 7th of 1941, when Pearl Harbor was bombed by the Japanese, when American factories were at full capacity. Preparing for World War II was the final push the United States needed to get out of the Great Depression, and the eyes of America were now turned on defeating the Axis powers.